Hello and welcome back to KSP 101. Today is after a long week of absence. Pretty sure I don't have to explain what exactly is going on in the world, so we're going to jump right into it. Last time we left off returning from deploying a probe to splash down and land on the surface of Lathe, or probes, and we came back and found out that we are off to BOP, and there is a very special Easter egg that we are going to be checking out while we are at BOP, taking care of all the missions that we can do per contract there. And when we last left off, we were talking about how we were going to do that, and we ultimately ended up deciding on sending a drone relay station, the KSS-3A. Right. We're going to send that out into orbit around BOP, and then we're going to follow that up by sending a J2, I believe it's the C. We're going to send the J2C out to dock up with the KSS-3A, and then descend down to the surface of BOP, check out that Easter egg, deploy the breaking ground science, and come back home. And at that point, I believe we will be heading off to Pole, and that'll wrap up all the moons around Duna, I believe, except for landing on Lathe and returning after landing. And we'll see if we will have to do that next, or if we'll have to go to Eve and take care of the same thing there after we're done with the 2 remaining moons at Jewel. Or it may even send us off to Dres, Moho, or Elu. Hopefully one of them. Alright, now let's begin by making sure there are no Kerbals in this crew cabin, go back to the vessel, and we will launch it from the Mun. However, before we do that, let's go to the tracking station and make sure that we have a window set up so we can transfer between Kerbin and Jewel and make our way off to BOP from there. We can begin by focusing on the sun, make it easy on ourselves. And then we need to locate Jewel. It is over there, so we have about a little over half of Kerbin's orbit to rotate around until we're lined up properly with Jewel so we can make that transfer. So let's go ahead and knock that out. And like I mentioned before, I'm going to cover this in every episode just in case people are like jumping around in episodes and missing information. In order to get this lined up, it's just like every other world. We want to make sure that Kerbin is at the edge of its orbit where you can draw a line straight to Jewel. And since we already have some relays out there, we don't actually have to draw a line in our minds or whatever, but we can actually see it right there. And as soon as it's at the edge of its orbit, where that line is no longer inside of Kerbin's orbit, and is lined up with Jewel right about now, we'll cut that warp. Now let's focus on Kerbin, find out where the Mun is relative to Jewel, and Kerbin's orbit. Okay, it's on the other side of where it needs to be, so let's warp it on over until it's at the edge of its orbit, in line with Jewel, which we're not too far off from now. Let's continue to rotate that around. Once it's right where it needs to be, we'll go ahead and cut the warp. We're going to leave a little bit of play on its positioning. That way we have time to get the vessel in orbit around the Mun, and then we can finish preparing its location and orbit of Kerbin relative to Jewel for the perfect transfer. Alright, so we have that down. Let's leave the tracking station and launch the KSS-3A. So we'll head back to the launch pad now. And just in case anything happens, like the game deciding to crash or something cutting my feed, I'm going to update that quick save so we don't have to do the time warp again. I know it's a very famous jig to do, but I'm not a fan. Alright, KSS-3A, make sure nobody's in the vessel, and launch from the Mun by holding X or A on the Xbox, and then selecting the Mun launch site. Once that's loaded up, we will do our standard Mun launch by kicking up to about 50 meters per second, and then going full sideways towards the 90-degree angle of inclination, and wait for our periapsis to hop out to about 50,000 meters, or 50 kilometers, and then warp over to that and circularize around the Mun. Let's make sure everything is as it should be before we launch though. Let's aim the camera up at the docking port, get a good look up here. And we have our panels deployed, communitrons deployed, we have tons of relayability. Everything is looking good. Let's hit those 2 control sticks in, refocus on the center of mass, set our SAS on, throttle all the way up, and launch. And as soon as that hits 50 meters per second, I'm looking to tilt over. Once it's about halfway, I'll slow it down a little bit for a little bit more accuracy. Staying in the blue, trying not to lose altitude. We are definitely going to clear everything ahead of us now, so just want to make sure that's a little higher, maybe 3-4 degrees or so. Alright, let's go to the map view and watch that apoapsis as it extends out. Once it hits 50,000, we're going to cut the throttle completely off. Let's check our altitude. As soon as it hits 5,000 or higher, we can go ahead and time warp over. Let's make sure we are set to prograde, so as soon as we arrive at the apoapsis, sorry, not the periapsis, once we arrive there, it'll automatically lock back on to the prograde mark, and we can make our circularization burn, which won't take much more of this delta V that we have. And this definitely should be enough to at least get us out to full orbit with a little fuel remaining that we can use to refuel the lander for its return if necessary, or for its landing, as we are going to have to do a little bit of a polar burn, a normal polar burn, meaning locking onto the normal mark here. We're almost at 50,000. Let's cut that time warp, go back to our map and see how far we are. Seems to reorient to the prograde mark pretty well. Can't remember, there are some of these that I need to put nukes in that I keep forgetting about. We'll check that out with the J2C when the time comes. Alright, let's finish warping over to that then. And get this ball rolling. Can warp within 10 seconds, it should be fine. By the time it's fully locked back onto the prograde mark, it won't even take but a moment of thrust. Let's make sure to exit warp mode and kick the tire and light the fire. As soon as that wraps around, we will cut it. There we go. Should be a nice, okay, 54.7 by 55.8. Not bad, we'll take it. Let's update the quick save. Zoom all the way out so we can find Joule. Let's turn this on so we can get some marks to reference. See the sun's over there, Joule should be out here. Let's set Joule as our target, zoom back in, find out where the Mun is relative to Joule in Kerbin's orbit. Pretty much right on where it needs to be, honestly. So we'll just go ahead and continue. Let's time warp over to the other side of the Mun until we are in line with Joule. Right about here should be fine. And after we lock back onto the prograde mark, we should see that the target mark is starting to dip into it. And that's about the time that we need to burn. I'm going to rotate the vessel a little bit too, because I like to keep the panels up and down for maximum solar exposure. It's fairly close. I'd like the target mark to be a little closer to the prograde mark, so I'm going to warp ahead just a wee bit more. Now it's halfway into the prograde mark, we'll take that. As soon as we're nice and stable, begin to throttle up nice and slow until we are at full throttle. Let's zoom all the way out beyond the Kerbin system so we can keep track of this. Keeping an eye on that G-force meter. As soon as it moves down a tad, it'll be time to stage. Let's go ahead and check that. And stage. Those nice and smooth back to the map. How much delta V do we have? About 1900. Plenty to make the encounter with Joule. So I doubt we'll have to worry about that. So for now, let's let that apoapsis gain some altitude. Just waiting for it to start to cross the path of Joule's orbit. Our degree of inclination is not off too bad, but we're not worrying about that right now, since we are under the influence of both the Mun and Kerbin with this trajectory line. You'll see why we are not too worried about that at the moment here in just a few moments. Because once we get this Joule encounter, we're not going to be able to see our line. We're going to have to leave the Mun sphere of influence to be able to see that. So right now we're just focused on getting the encounter. Looks like it's pretty spot on our transfer window. We just need to adjust our degree of inclination. It's cut now that we've touched the line. Slowly bring it up. You can highlight the approach node. You can see it's closing in pretty quickly, even at a very minimal throttle. It's one of the best transfers we've had in this series. I'm gonna let that go just a little longer. See, if I focus on Joule and zoom in, we're not gonna see our line. And that's why we weren't worried about it, because we are still under the influence of the Mun. So we have to warp out of there until we are only under the influence of Kerbin. Let's highlight that Joule encounter, make sure we don't lose it. Manually time warp ahead once, looking good. Alright, let's get completely out of the Mun sphere of influence. Now, let's cut our time warp and put our focus back on Joule. Now we can see where we're coming, or where we're heading, sorry. It's been a long day. Alright, anyways, let's try to correct this first by heading to... Wow, okay, so we don't have an ascending node. That means that we should be relatively close to where it would be. So in that case, let's point anti-normal, pretending that there is an ascending node over here. And we're just going to watch the descending node, since we don't have the ascending node to reference that by. We're going to try to get that close to 0. But at the same time, we're going to watch our trajectory line here. And we need to get Joule's orbit, which is highlighted right now, flush with itself. And then begin to raise that periapsis up by burning anti-normal until it's nice and in line with Joule's orbital line. And once we have that, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Alright. That's pretty good. It's fairly in line with Joule equatorially. That's exactly what we want. Let's go back to prograde and bring that in a little closer. We can go ahead and shut these two outer engines off for a little more control. I'm going to leave that central engine on until we see just how much that impacts the periapsis. But now that we are pretty much locked on to prograde, let's return to the map view, go top down. Oh yeah, that's moving it nicely. Okay, we're gonna move it in fairly close to Bop's line. Once it's close, we're gonna cut the engine and then open that central engine and move the thrust limiter down close to just a few points. Zoom back in on the map, re-highlight that periapsis, and let's bring it in until it's right on top of Pole's line when it meets it. And we're watching the periapsis point for that, right there. Now that we have that, it's time to head to Joule. Make sure that we are coming in from this side, so we enter our orbit the same way all of the moons are. Let's update our quick save and begin time warping. Now, to begin the time warp, like always. Manually time warp ahead once, barely affected our line, leaving that on its manual time warp. Let's go ahead and warp into the Joule system to make sure we are not going to make contact with pole by warping close to its line. Okay, we can't auto warp yet. We need to leave Kerbin's sphere of influence. So let's go ahead and manually time warp up until we are out of there, and then let's warp on over outside of Pole's orbit. We have a long journey to that point. So in a few minutes we'll be there. Looks like our solar panels are not in line with the sun at all, or Kerbal. But we're not losing power, so not worried about it. I believe there are some nukes inside of this thing anyways. Can attempt to take a look as it keeps moving, but let's find out. See if we can't spot any nukes in here. It's a little difficult to see though. I believe I just spotted some with the monopropellant. Yep, there's a nuke right there. So we don't have to worry about the power. That's good. Hopefully it's the same for the J2A. Alright, so, refresher. We are sending this, hey, we have some sunlight exposure. Good. Alright. We are sending this out to Joule to make contact with, if I can grab a hold of it. Alright, let's just focus on Bop. That's where we're heading. To make contact with Bop here. Bop is a very small moon. Pretty much just a little tiny asteroid. And let's check out the info that we reviewed in the last episode. Not going to worry about that info. I already read that one. But we're going to check the parameters. Now, the SOI is about 1,221 kilometers. So, what you're wanting to do for your closest orbit here would be about 12,000 meters, or 12 kilometers. You should be safe in an orbit at that height. The gravity here is incredibly low. I think it was comparable the most to Gilly when we checked it out, but I'm not 100% certain. What I am 100% certain of, 0.06 is not much gravity. Really nothing else to check out there. But our destination, when we send the J2A out, once it's docked up to the station, and we take care of the rendezvous, docking, and transferring between the two vessels, and knock out all of the in the space around BOP contracts and missions, we're going to be landing the J2A around this area right here. Okay, it just went past us right there. There's a small little plateau there. That's where that Easter egg is, and that is where we are heading. And hopefully we can knock that out by the end of this episode, perhaps. If not, we will in the next episode. Now we are about a minute and a half away. Not really too sure there's much else to explain for now. We can zoom out, put the focus back on Joule, so we're not rotating so much. Once we arrive at this periapsis, we are going to immediately retroburn. And once we have an orbit started, once Joule has a hold of us and we won't be escaping Joule, we're going to warp around to the ascending or descending node, most likely the descending node, and correcting our degree of inclination and orbit around Joule until it matches with BOP's. After which we will warp back around to our believe it'll be at that point our apoapsis, and retrograde burn until we have a nice encounter with Bop. And after we do that, we'll time warp over into Bop's sphere of influence, and we will put ourselves into, let's go with somewhere between 30 to 50,000 meters in orbit around Bop. It just depends on how good of a control that we have while we're in the space around Bop due to its lack of gravity. It'll be very similar to doing or attempting to do anything around Gilly, which we did quite a while ago. And we are very close to entering the Joule system. We've gone beyond our periapsis out here. We are now descending to Joule. We should be able to spot it somewhere as we are making our approach into the Joule system. There it is. And we are here. Let's just lock our SAS where it is for now, so we're not rotating around too much. There we go. Good. Alright, now let's see where we are relative to everything else in the Joule system. We are definitely clear of Pole. Looks like we're about to hit the ascending node, so in fact, we will go ahead and do that correction burn before we hit that periapsis. So let's line ourselves up to be locked on to the anti-normal mark. Since we are heading to the ascending node, we need to bring it down 13.4 degrees. Once we are locked on to anti-normal, we will update the quick save. Let me turn those tunes on. It's been 22 minutes, no music. What am I thinking? Alright, let's update that quick save and warp over to that ascending node. Again, we're going to manually time overhead once, and then warp one over to the ascending node nice and close. Once we get there, let's warp ahead just a wee bit more, say about here. Let's exit time warp mode so that doesn't get in the way. And let's begin to, we need to turn the thrustometer back up on the central engine and reactivate these two outer engines really quickly. Let's go ahead and do that. Once that's done, we have 264 meters per second of delta V. Well, that didn't go as planned. Let's roll with it though. We did reduce it fairly well anyways. Let's just go ahead and stick to the original plan. Let's be prepared to lock retrograde and head on over to the periapsis. Manually time warp ahead just a hair, and then we will time warp. This will put us about 20 minutes out from it. We'll wait until we arrive there. We'll let it reorient to the retrograde mark. Let's rotate the vessel just a hair as well, so we're lined back up nicely. Once that's done, we can continue to time warp the rest of the way over to the periapsis. And once we arrive, again we are just retro burning until we achieve orbit around Joule. And from there, we have a little bit more work to do. Let's get this thing over to that periapsis a little quicker. Once we're about 30 seconds away from the periapsis, we will go full throttle. Zoom out a wee bit until we can see the entire system. Let's highlight the Joule escape node. Once we have that highlighted, we just need to keep an eye on that. It is Time to stage, though, I would say. It's not showing it, but it definitely was. It's still showing 54 meters per second for some reason. Alright, let's go back to the map view, re-highlight the escape node, wait for that to wrap itself around Joule, put itself under Joule's sphere of influence. Once we get that, we can do our degree of inclination correction burning that we were about to try to do with that ascending node that we lost. That's okay. It's not really gonna matter a whole lot. There's our descending node making its way back onto our line. That's where we're heading now. Now that we have an orbital line, since we don't really want to wait forever to warp around on that, let's bring it in just a little bit more. Say about halfway. Alright, we will cut it right about there. And in fact, we already have an encounter or approach node popping up, which is pretty nifty. Let's point normal in anticipation of arriving at the descending node. Looks like we did knock off a few degrees, but we still have quite a bit more to go. But we still have plenty of delta V in this thing. As always, these are over-engineered for your consideration. Now, we are locked on to the normal navball mark. Let's update the quick save, manually time warp ahead once, and then warp ourselves over to that descending node. Let's exit warp mode so we don't affect that. And now it's just a matter of waiting until we are out at that descending node. We're going to make sure to not have to do this more than once though. And you will see how here in a moment. Let's go ahead and also highlight this closest approach node. Halfway to the descending node now. Let's go ahead and get everything highlighted. Our apoapsis, our periapsis, our descending node, our ascending node. Get our approach nodes highlighted as well. We can also get our vessel highlighted, but now that we arrived at the descending node, let's go ahead and focus on that. Let's burn until that is back up to 0. Once it's nice and close to 0 though, we will cut the engine and then manually time warp over to the descending node again. And then once we arrive, we'll finish it off with a very light throttle burn. We should be right on top of it right about now. Now that that green arrow is pointing directly into that little dot on our command pod icon. And there we go. Now, we just need to warp back over to our periapsis. Once we arrive, we will be retro burning into an encounter. Looks like we have a good bit of burning to do, maybe. Okay, now that we have pretty much arrived at that periapsis, we can go ahead and time warp a little closer. But once we are there, that's fairly close. 5 minutes away. I'm going to let it go ahead and lock back onto retrograde, update the quick save, and then time warp a little closer to that. And then we will begin retro burning until we have a good encounter. I believe we'll let it wrap around once, and then let it come back around a second time, and keep that encounter. But we'll find out. Where there's not much gravity, we may have to take the first encounter. Alright, let's do all that now. Update the quick save. Manually time warp ahead about 3.5 minutes until we're about 20-30 seconds away. We'll cut there and slowly throttle up, keeping an eye on those approach nodes. Just waiting to see. There we are. Just gotta keep a close eye on those and be ready to kick it off whenever that gets our encounter. Looks like we are in track to have only one encounter in this position. So as soon as we get it, we're gonna take it right about, well, it should have been about there, but let's slowly warp until maybe we get it. Still not seeing it. That's interesting. Let's go back to prograde. We might have to warp out to the periapsis to finish that off. But as soon as we see it where it was when it was a lot closer than this, we'll cut the engines and then warp out to the periapsis and finish it from there. Okay, we are back to the prograde. Let's go ahead and slowly throttle up and wait for that to appear as it did. There we are. Now let's manually time warp ahead just a little bit, and then we will warp out to the apoapsis. By the time we arrive, we should already be pointing retrograde, and that's what we're going to start our burn with. Let's take a closer look at these. Closest approach is there. Indeed, we are going to need to retro burn. It may even be better to do a radial out burn, but we shall see. We're already at the halfway mark for the episode. We should be able to get the J2C vessel out and docked up with this after we put it in orbit. Now that we've arrived, we have locked back onto retrograde. Let's update the quick save and very carefully throttle up. Okay, so that's moving us away. Let's point prograde. Yeah, could go with radio out, but usually that takes more delta V. Let's stick to prograde. Let's get a closer look at this so we can see the numbers a little better. We're about 10,000 kilometers away from an encounter. That is very quickly going to go down. 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 12. And there's our encounter. Let's put our focus on BOP. Zoom in. Let's get rid of time warp mode. Looking good. Looking very good. Lined up very well. Let's go ahead and move that in a little closer. 64,000 meters. Let's cut the throttle limiter down on our main engine as close to 0 as possible, and try to bring that down to about 50,000 very carefully. Let's update the quick save there, and then we need to make sure that we are coming in correctly. We are definitely not coming in on the correct side, so let's keep prograde burning until it pops out the other side, and we will carefully get that back out to 50,000 again. Once it's there, let's update the quick save. Now for the fun part. We need to raise that up a little bit, but it may cost less and be easier if we do that once we make orbit around BOP. We are going to have a lot to burn off. We're not really going to be collecting any science with this vessel. We're going to save that for our next vessel, so let's go ahead and make sure our engine is back up to full throttle on its limiter, and manually time overhead once. It did not affect the periapsis, which is good. Let's warp until we're fairly close to it. Let's see, still 10 minutes away, so that should be about 5. We'll warp there. Be prepared to point retrograde upon arrival. Let's exit warp mode so we don't affect it. And let's keep an eye out for our destination. I think I see it. No, I believe that's Tylo I'm seeing. Where's Bob? Should be fairly in line with it. Let's get rid of the UI, get a better view. Find out where Bop is relative to us. It's ahead of us. Okay. There you are. Hello, Bop. Didn't take much to get ourselves back to retrograde. Alright, so let's go back to map view. Let's warp until we're about 30 seconds away from the periapsis. Once we arrive, we will let it reorient to the retrograde mark. Zoom out a wee bit so we can keep an eye on the escape node, just like we do everywhere we go. Once we're about 10 seconds away from the periapsis, we will throttle up very slowly, keeping an eye on that escape node to see how much we are affecting it, and make our orbit. And after that, we will correct the orbit, and head back to the Space Center, and launch the J2C. Now let's begin to slowly throttle up, get a fix on how much we're affecting this. See, now that we're in orbit, barely throttling up at all is pushing that periapsis ahead of us. Need to be a little careful about that. Make sure not to bring either of those down too low. About 12,000 is as safe as it gets, but it's not what we're looking for. The station needs to be a little higher. Now let's warp until we're about at the halfway point on the orbit, lined up with the equator of pole. Once we get there, we're going to need to lower the line down, so we'll point anti-normal. And we will correct this down to, I believe it should be 90 on this side, but we'll find out here in a moment. It's either going to be 90 or 270. Let's find out. No, it's not going to be 90 or 270. It's going to be 180 or 0. There we go. I believe it's going to be 180. Looks like it is. Let's slowly throttle up and burn that degree of inclination down to up to 180. And once it's at 180, we should have a fairly equatorial orbit here around Bop. And we can do the second leg of the mission, sending out the manned vessel to rendezvous, dock up, and transfer between it and this station. Looks like we could use a little bit more of a correctional burn now. Let's line up the apoapsis and periapsis with the outside tips of our orbit here, warp to about the halfway point, and you can see the degree of inclination is going back down, which is why we are doing this again. Once we arrive, we will correct that back to 180 again. Once that is done, that's a lot more equatorial. Still not perfect, but close to it. Just burn just a wee bit more until it's at 180. There we go. It's pretty close to being a perfect equatorial orbit. Let's click save. Make sure the vessel's looking good. And time warp until we have some daylight to be able to see it a little better. We're about to be finished off with this stage, which is pretty perfect, to be honest. Let's make sure it's just set to SAS and not any of these nodes. Let's cut the time warp and take a look-see. We need to open this docking port shield and turn on the lights. And now it's ready and waiting for a manned crew vessel, which we will launch here in just a moment. Be a shame to waste 90 meters per second of fuel, because it's probably still a decent amount of fuel. And I'm seeing over a couple hundred units at least, so we'll keep that for now. Let's update the quick save. Well, first, let's want ourselves prograde. That way, once the vessel's here, aligned with it equatorially, we just have to rotate it on one axis. And our lock-on will be a little more accurate as we are making our approach. Alright, once that's there, let's just lock back on to regular SAS. To rotate the panels so they are up and down, north and south, for maximum solar exposure. And update the quick save one last time so we can head back to the Space Center and launch the J2C. I have about 20 minutes left, give or take, if we want to hit the hour mark. I think it's going to... Let's head to the launch pad. Go down to the J2C once all those are loaded up. And let's make sure the proper kerbals are in the vessel. I'm going to send the red shirt crew. The pilot is Ailey, our engineer, Millman, and our scientist, Helwig. And let's launch it from the Mun. But, as I always seem to forget, let's go to the tracking station and set up our transfer window. I'd really like to get this thing out there before ending the episode, though, so we can knock out the landing and the Easter egg and then end the next episode, and maybe making it back home after that in the next episode as well. Alright, let's set up this transfer window real quick. It's about where it was last time, look at that. And once we get that done, we're pretty much going to do the same exact thing that we just did until we get it in orbit around pole, or BOP. Once it's there, it's going to be a little different. It's going to be similar to how we got the BOP encounter around Joule. We're going to be around BOP making the encounter with the station and docking up to it. Preparing to land on BOP and check out this very legendary Easter egg. One of the most popular ones, arguably. To each their own. I prefer the last Easter egg that we checked out, but this one's not too bad. But a lot of people would say they regard this Easter egg with a lot more importance. But not to discredit people that think that or anything, but it's nowhere near as important as the last one that we checked out. If you know anything about the original story that was supposed to take place in the game, it was the final Easter egg. Now, let's go ahead and head to the launch pad, get our red shirt crew back in our J2C, and send them on their way. Go to the Mun launch site, and launch that bad boy. Hopefully I made the necessary adjustments to this vessel. Think of it as a power issue. If not, we're just gonna roll with it. See, the time here on the East Coast where I'm at is 6:20 p.m. I have roughly 3 hours and 45 minutes to 4 hours left. I'm curious, where is the Mun in relation to Joule around Kerbin here? Still has a little bit of a ways to go. Well, let's go ahead and time warp it over to where it needs to be. It's there. Nice and in line with Jewel back there. We will cut the time warp. Let's warp ahead just a little bit more. I'd say that's pretty gosh darn close. Alright, now let's hope that didn't bring about the Kraken in this thing though. Seems pretty stable now. It wasn't at first for a moment there. Let's activate the SAS, throttle up, and let's also go ahead and activate the resources menu so we can keep an eye on our power and launch. Now we're about to find out if the Kraken got a hold of this thing while we were time warping. Looking good. Once we get about 50 meters per second, let's head over to the 90-degree horizontal mark on that ball. It's moving awfully slow. Not much in the way of control here. I think we did deactivate the gimbaling on the vectors though. That's one thing that needed correcting. Good. Glad that's already taken care of. So there won't be as much wobble and wobble. It's been about a week. Kind of forgot about the wobble. But I very quickly remembered once I saw all those vectors. Alright, we are nice and sideways. Should be able to clear all the surface obstacles ahead of us. Let's go to our map view, take a look at that apoapsis, find out where it is. It's got a ways to go. We're just waiting on that to hit 50,000. We may have to stage first. Slowly burning through that delta V. Watch the G-force meter while we're in map view. There it is. Time to stage. Let's cut the engines. Stage. And slowly throttle back up as we move away from those outer stages. Seems relatively safe. Let's go back to full throttle. Nice and slow. Definitely don't forget to disable the gimbaling on those vector engines. Alright, so let's deactivate the SAS. Let's check our altitude. We are well over 50,000, or 5,000, sorry. So let's warp on over to that apoapsis. Kind of warping a little slow right now, so we can zoom out and set Joel as our target ahead of time. Once we have that, let's zoom back in. Figure out where it is relative to the Mun and our vessel. Almost like last time. Alright. Let's continue to warp out to that apoapsis now. Once we arrive about a minute away from the apoapsis, we will cut the warp, reactivate the SAS, and lock on the prograde. It's a larger vessel. It does not want to move a whole lot, so that's why I stopped at about a minute away, to give it plenty of time to lock onto that prograde mark as it burns through all the energy it has right now. I'm going to disable SAS and let it slowly move over to that prograde mark on its own now. Once it's a little closer, I'll reactivate the SAS and I'll be turning it on and off, trying to stabilize it and stop it from moving past the prograde mark, where there is no SAS controlling its movement right now. So if I turn it on right now, it'll try to lock on to the 30 mark, but it'll keep moving out beyond it a little bit until it slows down enough to move back. So I'm going to activate the SAS right about here at the tip of the prograde. And it's going to slow down a little bit, but still keep moving out. Once it's almost stopped, I'm going to deactivate the SAS, let it continue to the center of the prograde mark, lock it back on, lock it back on the prograde, and that will use less energy, if you ever happen to have that problem. I did not add enough to this vessel, I keep forgetting to, but we are now at the apoapsis. Let's throttle up. Watching for that periapsis to pop out. As soon as it does, we need to make sure to cut near 50,000 as it wraps around. There's our 50 by 50, looking good. Let's update the quick save. That gave us a little bit of power, but we want to save that. Let's deactivate our SAS so we can save that energy. And time warp until Joule and our vessel's orbit is lined up at the edge of its orbit. Then it'll be time to lock back on the prograde and begin burning to the Joule encounter. Well, I'd say about here is close enough. Let's begin to move it back towards the prograde mark with the SAS still off, trying to keep it on that 90 line. It's moving pretty good now, so I will let go of the stick and let it continue on to the prograde mark. It'll keep that momentum, but it won't use any energy, which is especially useful right now because we are on the dark side of the Mun without any nukes. And the solar panels that we have are effectively useless until we get through the lower stages and get to the mid stages of this vessel. But once it's pretty much centered with that prograde mark, I'm going to stop it from moving any further very quickly and very simply by activating the time warp. It's a bit of a, well, I'd call it a feature. Some might call it a bug, but just waiting for it to get to the center of the prograde mark. The target mark is still moving to where I want it to be, about halfway into the prograde mark, which is good. By the time we arrive at the prograde mark, it'll appear more outside of the prograde mark. So we're going to push just a hair past the middle, and then as we time warp, it'll move back towards the middle, and the target mark will move towards the prograde mark with it. And we'll still have plenty of electrical charge to lock onto the prograde mark completely once we arrive at that point and can activate the engines to take over our power needs. Alright, so now we are approaching the prograde mark. Once we're about at the opposite side of that's when we're going to activate the manual time warp. Say right the prograde mark and the target mark. We'll do it then. Right about now. Now it's not going to move anymore except back towards the prograde mark as we rotate around our orbit, and that the edge of the target mark should hit the prograde mark at about the same time we do. Say right about there. We'll deactivate the warp, reactivate the SAS, lock back on the prograde, let it reorient to the center of the prograde mark from there. Looks like it's pretty much there now. Let's throttle up, nice and slow, and zoom. And we will be on our way to the Joule system. Say we probably have to extend this episode about 30 more minutes if we want to make this encounter, rendezvous, and docking happen. but that's what we're gonna do, because it will make the next episode a lot more streamlined and easy. Alright, so we have about 300 meters per second until delta V left. We have just left the Mun sphere of influence on our trajectory line and curvature. I believe it will take more delta V than that to get out to Joule, even from the Mun sphere of influence. So we'll just keep an eye on that until it's time to stage. Can't really see much though. I see, it probably would have helped our mission a little bit if we would have extended the solar panels when we launched. Whoopsie. Okay, it's time to stage anyways. Let's deactivate the engines and stage. And let's make sure we have everything as it should be. Those are moving away from us, yes. Very good. Let's throttle up. And continue on to Joule. Just want to make sure that everything is as it should be on the command pod. Not worried about the Communitron. There are no more solar panels to extend. Don't believe anyways. So let's go back to the map view. The Apple Axis is taking its sweet time, isn't it? Let's try to get a better view of the command pod. Highlight it. And aim the camera there. Hurt to turn on the lights, I guess, since we do have engines powering us right now. It's not really showing us too much here, though. I'm not seeing any more solar panels to deploy, so it's just those two. I really should have put some nukes in this thing. I need to remember to do that for the next mission. Alright, so we're almost out to Dress's line. Once it reaches that point, it'll move much faster. But for now, we'll just wait for that. Lack of wobble compared to when these vectors had their gimbling enabled instead of locked. Very groovy. Gotta remember that always. We should be close to Dress's line. We'll be rapidly increasing in the billions of meters at that point. Go out until it's at about, it's a little further out than 66 billion, probably closer to 70 or 80 billion. Maybe 70. How much delta V do we have now? Let's go ahead and put our focus on Joule, keeping an eye on that encounter. And once those touch, we have our encounter. Let's leave the Mun sphere of influence and zoom in on Joule. Let's cut our time warp. Let's see what we're looking at. Let's see what we are working with. We need to bring that in a wee bit closer. Say about there should be okay. Now let's find out where our ascending and descending nodes are. Looks like our descending node is out just a wee bit. Let's go ahead and start moving towards the normal mark. And this again will take a little bit more time because this vessel does not like to get off its butt and move a whole lot, but that's okay. It'll still get the job done. And once we're closer to being pointing normal or anti-normal, the vessel will be straight up and down. The panels won't have any issues collecting power. We're just going to go ahead and let it use up all that energy that it needs to use to get down. After we time warp and leave Kerbin's sphere of influence, that descending node might disappear on us. So it's crucial that we are fully prepared for the burn when we arrive on that node, or where it would have been, as it most likely will disappear on us. Now, as soon as we are locked on to the normal mark, we will update the quick save and warp to where that descending node is and should be once we arrive. If it disappears on us, it's not going to matter. We are still burning normal from there. But we do need to also make sure that the ascending node is highlighted. Oh, there is no ascending node. So the only thing that we may have to reference it with is our trajectory line over a joule. But let's go ahead and time warp just a little bit ahead, and then set it to auto warp right on top of that descending node. There's our energy filling back up. Very good. And now the descending node, well, it's on the other line, which is the line we would have if we just fly by Joule and keep going. That's not what we're going by though. We're going by where it should have been and would have been had it not been for that encounter with Joule, which is where we are warping to right now. Which is why we made sure to put that right on top of that descending node. Now technically, we can kind of use this descending node as a reference to how much we have to burn, but we're going to do both. We're going to keep an eye on that and the ascending node over here, as well as the line that we have for our trajectory here at Joule. Let's go ahead and make sure that we have a good view of that, and that Joule's orbital line is flush with itself like so. And then once we arrive, we will burn until that periapsis is in line with this yellow highlighted line of Joule's orbit, which is flush with itself, like so. And if we are referencing the ascending and descending nodes on the secondary trajectory line, which is once we leave Joule's sphere of influence, should we choose to just fly by it, if we are referencing those, once that periapsis touches Joule's orbital line, those should be at 0. Let's begin to burn normal now that we have arrived. Those are not going down to 0, are they? So we can't rely on those. We have to rely solely by sight on that periapsis. Let's zoom in and get a better view of that. Let's exit the time warp mode as well. Now they're starting to go down to 0. Let's cut our engines and get rid of these relay comm network lines so we can see a little better, and continue to slowly throttle up and raise that periapsis. As soon as it touches that line of Joule's orbit, we will cut the engine. And there we can see our ascending and descending nodes are very close to 0. Now, we just need to go back to prograde once we are locked on the prograde, we will slowly move that periapsis in until it is in line with Bop's orbital line. We'll go ahead and set that as our target as well. Have just about as much of a degree of inclination to correct upon arrival as we did with the station. Not bad. Hopefully, now that those panels are deployed, we shouldn't have any energy issues realigning ourselves to the prograde mark. Once we are there, we will update the quick save, adjust our engine thrustability, maybe. We'll see how much it affects it with a very minor and short duration throttle up, just to see how it affects that periapsis first, before we make that call. While I'm at it, I'm currently sipping on some Dr. Pepper cream soda. Not bad. If you like Dr. Pepper, check it out. It's not that bad. Okay, we are locked back onto the prograde. Let's update the quick save and slowly throttle up and see what happens to the periapsis. Yep. We're going to leave it right there. Was totally expecting that. Let's update the quick save, since it is pretty much right where we want it. Now we don't have to mess with the engines once we arrive at the descending node. Let's go ahead and time warp ahead a little bit there. Make sure that we are ready to point anti-normal. And we will warp outside of Pole's orbital line. And we will arrive there in just a few minutes. I'm going to take this opportunity to take a very short break, since we are extending the episode. I'm going to let it warp out there. I will be back once we arrive. back, and we are now under a minute away from arriving outside of Pole's orbital line, making sure that we do not make contact with Pole, much like how you would want to do with Minmus or the Mun when you are returning to Kerbin. Let's take a look at everything. We already have our separation nodes with the closest approach. Looks like Bop is going to be on the opposite side of its orbit, so we are going to have to do a little bit of finagling to get this encounter. Not much different than it was last time though. Say we're about 30 to 40 seconds away now. Let's go ahead and do a quick check of our vessel. We have about 450 meters per second or so of delta V remaining. We are coming in and out of power due to the location of the panels relative to the exposure of the sun, or Kerbal, but that'll be okay. Let's just make sure that we are locked onto anti-normal upon arrival, so we can go ahead and get that positioning knocked out of the way before we warp to that ascending node. Let's go back to the map view and exit warp mode so we don't affect that. So we are now about 20 seconds or so out. Let's go ahead and highlight all of our stuff here, we can keep an eye on everything. And there we are, closing the gap. So here in just a few moments we'll be in the Joule system sphere of influence, and then we will quickly time warp down to being right outside of Pole's orbit. Looks like it might be fairly close by the time we get there, but we are going to burst right through its line before it gets to us. That is good. Let's try to wait for that to point anti-normal. Looks like it's attempting to, though it has no power. Take a look-see and see what our situation looks like here. Get a nice tight zoom so we can see how much it's moving. Let's highlight our panels and get those open so we can keep an eye on their exposure. It would help if we rotate the vessel, but it barely has enough flow of energy on this one panel to automatically position itself to the anti-normal mark as is. So I'm just going to let it continue on until it gets to that anti-normal mark. In fact, it needs to be at the normal mark, because we are burning at a descending node, not an ascending node, so that's causing some complications. Let's time warp ahead just a little bit, see if we can't get any power on our way to that ascending node. There's a little bit of a power increase, not much though. See if we can't get just a wee bit more on the way, enough to get it to be able to get a kickstart like that. It should be moving. We are trying to point normal, so it should be moving up as well, but it is on its way to be pointing up. So I'm going to just deactivate the SAS, let it slowly collect some power, since there is a little bit of an energy flow hitting that panel, and let it naturally drift its way to that normal mark. This is going to take a good bit of time. Hopefully it doesn't extend us too much more on this episode. I'm gonna give it just a little bit of a nudge, even though it's not showing any power, to go a little quicker towards that mark if possible. Could activate the engines, but I don't want to affect our trajectory too much, and I don't want to waste too much of our delta V. So it's not really essential that we save a whole lot, because we still have this mid section here, which is an asparagus stage for 3 different stages. So we definitely have enough fuel, I would say. But we are starting to collect some power now, and it is still on track to the normal mark. Starting to see a little more solar exposure. It's not increasing our energy flow a whole lot, but we'll take it. More energy. Still no sign of it though. It should be popping up any time now. Definitely need to do something about the power ability on this vessel. Need to remember to correct that. Still no sign of it. If I had to guess though, I'm going to need to move it to the left some. So I'm just going to hold the stick to the left a little bit for a while. I can kind of see it starting to appear now. There it is. Let's check our solar exposure now. It's almost at 100% on that one panel. I'm going to time warp ahead a little bit and try to get a little more energy. But not too close to the descending node just yet. Maybe about halfway, say about there. And then I'm going to keep the SAS off and move it down towards that normal mark at a bit better pace now that we have some energy to work with. We should start getting more solar exposure out of both of these panels as well. Probably wouldn't hurt to try to rotate the vessel some to get that other panel exposed a little better. There we go. That doubled it up a little bit. Let's go ahead and cut that rotation now. Try to keep it to where both of those are exposed to some sunlight. Once that's fairly close to the normal mark, I'll time warp ahead manually once to stop it from moving. And then I'll warp a little closer to that descending node. See, that's about as good as it's going to get, right about there. Alright, now time to update the quick save just in case anything happens. Don't want to lose all that work. Now, let's hit the 2 sticks in, focus back on the vessel, highlight that descending node, and let's warp a little closer to it. Let's exit warp mode, warp a little closer actually, instead of exiting. We'll warp ahead until we're at about here. That way we can throttle up and keep that descending node ahead of us instead of losing track of it this time. Once we arrive, we immediately need to activate our SAS and lock ourselves on to that normal mark. We'll begin to throttle up just a little bit to push it ahead of us just a little bit. That way we don't lose it. Alright, very quickly let's exit, time warp, activate the SAS, lock onto that normal mark on the nav ball. Once it's there, we'll start to push that descending node up, but we need to make sure we're not pushing it too far ahead of us. We have a lot of time between us and the periapsis though, so that's okay. Let's go ahead and start pushing that. Try to push it as much as we can without pushing it beyond that periapsis. Be very close to zero by that point though. Looks like it's going to take a decent amount of our delta V to close those solar panel menus. About 20 to 30 seconds left on this burn. It is moving now. It's a little closer to zero. It'll get faster and faster. So we need to make sure to keep control of our throttle. Oh, time to get rid of that bottom stage. Very good. That'll help us with our energy problem just a wee bit more, since we won't have all those large control wheels. Let's make sure our throttle is down and stage. Then we'll throttle up just a hair to get away from that thing. Get a good view of it as it passes by. Hefty, hefty, hefty. Okay. Now, this won't require nearly as much power. Now we can start moving and shaking. Let's very quickly zoom in, get a lock on that descending node, and continue to push it closer to zero, but not all the way. We don't want it to push beyond that periapsis, but we don't want to lose it either. Once it's at about 0.5, I'm going to cut the throttle. I'm going to time warp over to it just a little behind it. Say about here. Should be fine. And once we arrive, we can finish bringing that down to zero and focus on our orbital insertion burn and making our encounter. So we can wrap this up and move on to the next episode, so we can check out an Easter egg and land on Bop and do some science. We can get a little closer than that. Let's warp to just a few seconds behind it. We just need to control our burn to keep it ahead of us. See, it's moving closer to us. Throttle up, slows it down. Throttle up more, pushes it. Let's cut the throttle, move a little closer. Say about there, and throttle up. As soon as that hits zero, it'll be time to cut. Alright, so that takes care of that. We can try to make it a little more perfect to where it wraps around, or begins to wrap around. Let's update our quick save and head to that periapsis. And be prepared to point retrograde upon arrival. Let's get a lock on that, manual warp ahead once, it did not affect it, very good. Now let's warp on over, we'll be a couple minutes behind it, we can warp a little closer than that. Let's be prepared to lock retrograde, and once it's locked on the retrograde, we will warp a little closer and begin our retro burn. This should not take as much power, but I want to make sure these panels are staying in the light, so I'm going to rotate a little bit. That should be a good enough rotation. Looks like it rotated just a wee bit more than I wanted to. There we go. We'll keep it right about there. That should be maximum exposure. Update the quick save and warp a little closer to that periapsis. We'll warp till we're about 30 seconds away from it. Two, one, cut. Alright, now let's begin to slowly throttle up. Full throttle when periapsis is still coming towards us. Cool. 400 meters per second of delta V, then it'll be time to cut. We should be getting orbit pretty quickly with this midsection, though it's got a lot of thrust to weight. Once we get that orbit achieved, cut the throttle. It is time to stage now, though. Saw a massive drop in our G-force gauge. Anytime you're in map view, always try to keep an eye on that. Let's move away from those and go back to our map view. Continue to bring that down into an orbit. Once we achieve the orbit again, we need to cut the throttle. And we can go ahead and set up our insertion into BOP from here, since our degree of inclination is already good to go. Let's highlight the closest approach, highlight the target node's position at closest approach, and bring our orbit down. Be prepared to cut it at any moment though. And then slowly bring that approach down. Continue to bring it down. We should see a closer approach pop back up again here shortly. If not, then we will have to extend that back out by burning prograde and do what we did with the station. We'll have to warp out to the apoapsis to finish setting up the encounter from there. So now we just need to wait for that to lock on the prograde. Make sure that we're rotated properly too while we're at it. Looks like I need to rotate this way. No, the other way. Okay. After we get that rotation so we can get our panels back in the light. Very good. Let's go back to the map view and burn until those are a lot closer, like they were. Shouldn't be too much more of a burn from here though. Right about there. Okay. Now let's warp on over to the apoapsis by manually warping ahead. It's looking like we may have to warp back around to the periapsis actually. But we'll find out. Let's cut the warp there. Looks like, yes, we are going to have to warp back around, so let's continue to warp until we are back at the periapsis. Once we are there, we will just retro burn again and see what we can get. Not good enough, I don't think. We're going to have to warp around a little bit until those are a little closer, either at the periapsis or the apoapsis. On the way back to the periapsis, let's slow it down just a wee bit. There it goes, shifting. Okay, so we need to wrap back around again. Still too far. We'll just let that wrap back around to the periapsis again. Once it gets close, we'll slow it down. Wait for that shift. It's a wee bit closer, but still not close enough. Still not close enough. I think it'll take a few more passes, but we'll find out. Hopefully along the way, one of these other moons don't grab us. It's a wee bit closer. Still going to take a few passes. Probably a couple more, but we're on track. Getting very close to pole there though, kind of concerned about that. Very good. Still a couple more passes to go. Don't have to worry about pole, it's passing right under us each time now. But we are getting a lot closer to BOP. Ooh, that was very close to pole. Hopefully that won't happen again. We're only maybe an orbit or two away now from where we need to be. And one more should do it. We should be able to work with that. We could work with it now if we wanted to, but trying to save some fuel. After this pass, we'll warp out to the Apoapsis. Let's do one more pass, try to get a little bit closer than that. Maybe even two. Might even get a free encounter by doing so, but we'll see. That brings it down to 50,000. Another 2 or 3, we might get a free encounter. If not very close to being an encounter. Woo, woo, woo. Okay, our degree of inclination. We don't have to worry about pull at all, I don't think. It's not looking like we'll have to. Alright, let's continue. And that brings it down to about 27. One more will bring it closer to about 7,000 meters away, or 7,000 kilometers away, sorry. Going to be awfully close in this pass. And there's our free encounter. Okay. Let's take a look-see. Let's focus on BOP, zoom in, and see what that looks like. We're coming in from the right side, which is good. Let's go ahead and set the station as our target. And let's find out what we can do to get our encounter right now. We are going to have to do a little bit of correctional burning on our degree of inclination, but we can't do that until we get there. It may be best to set up our encounter upon arrival, so let's do that. Let's go ahead and manually time warp ahead once, and then warp out to right when we enter BOP's sphere of influence, so we can get some science done first. Just lock on the regular SAS, so we're not using any power once we arrive. And we have arrived. Let's exit time warp, go to our vessel view, and do some science, since it is our first time entering BOP's space with some Kerbals. Can grab a barometric reading, some gravity data, and we'll grab what do we have on this side? It's probably, yep, the temperature. And we can't grab any seismic data since we're in space. Let's grab a crew report now. And then we need to grab some mystery goo data, and we will EVA our scientist to collect all that and reset that mystery goo. After we collect it, alright, let's get our scientist out there. Turn her light on so we can keep a good view of her. Nice and lit up. Let's begin by grabbing the mystery goo. We'll collect that and then reset the canister, or restore it. And then we will grab our temperature reading, grab our gravity reading, and then we will grab our barometric pressure reading. Should be able to, yep, okay. Let's grab that. Let's grab the crew report out of the pod, and then we will grab an EVA report. And that'll be it for the science we can do high over BOP for now. Let's get back in the vessel and continue along with our mission to get the encounter with the station. Let's go ahead and open our docking port. This didn't help with the power much. Let's make sure those lights are off for now. And go back to map view and update our quick save. We will also go ahead and make sure we are pointing anti-normal, so that once we arrive at the ascending node, we can try to knock that out before we start retro burning, at the periapsis. That'll work. And this is now officially going to be probably a 2-hour episode. But I won't let it go any further than that, if I don't have to. Alright, let's go ahead and warp out to that ascending node, fairly close to it. And refocus on our vessel, zoom in, see just how quick we are moving towards that. Let's go ahead and burn that down, but not beyond that periapsis, not too close to it either, because we need time to reorient to retrograde. We'll stop it at 5. It's already close enough to the periapsis. Let's warp a little closer to it and be prepared to burn quickly, keeping it ahead of us. As controlled as possible without pushing it too far ahead of us. Stopping it at 0, as close to it as possible. About there. Very good. Alright. Let's immediately get ourselves pointing retrograde. It's very interesting to be able to see that station and that flag over here. That's so cool. Okay. Let's very quickly get to retrograde, and at the 10-second mark on the periapsis, 9, let's go ahead and start the throttle up. And do so until we make orbit here at BOP. Let's go full throttle. As soon as we get that orbit, we will cut the thrust. Very close. Let's cut the thrust now. Alright, let's check that descending node. Still at 0. Groovy. Alright, we need to move out to the apoapsis. And upon arrival, we will bring the periapsis down to about 50,000. See, what's our max apoapsis and periapsis on the station? 54 by 51.9. So we will burn that down to about 50,000. And once it's there, we'll warp over to it and burn retrograde until we get the encounter with the station. And then we'll take it from there. Alright, let's keep an eye on that periapsis. We do need to be careful. So let's cut these 2 outer engines off. And after we do that, we will lower the thrust limiter on the central engine down to about maybe a 1/5. That's about 15 point something. Alright, let's highlight the periapsis now that we're back in the map view, and we will burn that down nice and smooth and slow until it's at about 50,000 meters. Once it gets close, let's cut the throttle all the way off, and then slowly bring it down to 50,000. Alright, we'll keep it there. Let's update the quick save. And manually time warp ahead once. Didn't affect it at all. Very good. Let's, before we warp over, highlight the intersect nodes. And then warp fairly close to the periapsis. Exit time warp so it doesn't affect it. And now, as soon as we lock on the retrograde, it's just a matter of getting one of those intersects down to 0. And it's very likely going to be the second intersect node, but we do need to keep an eye on our periapsis and apoapsis as we are doing this. Once that's locked onto retro, let's update the quick save and begin to retro burn into an encounter. There's the intersect 2. It's going to wrap around quite a bit. Let's just go ahead and let it wrap around a few times as that apoapsis comes down. When it starts to slow its rotation down, you know you're not going to have too many more of those until you can't get the encounter. So after that one, we'll let it wrap around one last time until it's fairly close to that node, and we'll cut, zoom in, let's put the thrust limiter back down a little more on that central stage now. As close to 0 as possible, honestly. 1.99 will take it. Let's re-highlight the intersect node. Slowly throttle up and bring that down to as close to 0 as possible. Once it's real close, I'm going to cut the throttle and let it slowly come in right about there. Now we just have 24.2 meters per second to burn once we arrive to kill our speed relative to the station. And we're going to be right on top of it too. So let's manually time warp ahead after updating the quick save. Didn't affect it at all. So let's warp a little closer. That'll put us about 45 seconds away. Upon arrival, we need to make sure the thrust limiter on this is probably at about half. But we'll keep that open, go to our map view, wait for that arrival, and very quickly adjust the limiter upon arrival. And we have arrived. Let's go back to our vessel view. Say that 5 times fast. That'll be fun. Alright, let's make sure that's at about half, and that we are oriented towards the target on our nav ball. And then let's find out how far away we are. About 39 seconds. We're not going to time warp, we're just going to let it slowly do its thing so it doesn't affect it much. We should be able to see it. We're not moving in too quickly, so it's not too much to worry about. Let's update our quick save though. Make sure that our docking port shield is open. It is. Very good. We're about, say, 45 seconds away from direct contact with that station, if we don't slow down. Just gonna let it mosey on over. See just how much that thrust limiter affects it though. At full throttle, it's about 1.5 meters per second. It's not bad. Once it's at about 100 meters, probably 150 meters to play it safe, we'll begin to go full throttle and slow down immediately at 150 meters in distance right now. Let that slow down to about 5 meters per second. We'll cut, let it get a little closer. We'll slowly throttle up. Don't want to get too close though, because when it reorients the vessel to line up, they might bump into one another. Let's go ahead and try to kill that now that we're a little closer. And we'll cut. Now that we are at 0 meters per second relative to the target, let's update our quick save, and we will set our control from the docking port on this vessel and set it to lock on to the target. Let's try to make sure that the docking port on this vessel is its target, if possible. Just got to get a good view to be able to do that. It can be a little difficult at times, but we need to make sure we do it. There we are. Now we can probably get a better view of that docking port. And make sure to set that as the target. It did in fact move a little. Alright, now that that's set, let's swap to the station and do the same thing. We need to make sure this dock, lock it onto target mode while it's wrapping itself around. Let's make sure to control from its docking port. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit. And there we go. Let's control from that. The other one's still in target mode, so it's automatically adjusting as we adjust the station, which luckily we have control over right now. Now we just need to rotate the station until its solar panels are sideways, and then we'll keep it in target mode, switch back to this vessel. It'll be out of target mode, which is what we want. We only want one vessel in target mode. Let's rotate until the panels on this are up and down, and then after we have that done, let's update the quick save and then go into docking mode. It's now time to dock up with the station. Now that we are in docking mode, let's activate the RCS, make sure you are in linear control mode, and pull the right trigger, and slowly start to move towards the station. Sorry. It's not really increasing it too much, so let's just increase it until the prograde mark pops up. And then we need to correct that until it's lined up with the target mark. And once we have that, let's lock our SAS again. Unlock, lock. And we can try to increase our speed just a wee bit, but remember, if your vessel takes a lot of thrust, to increase its speed, it's going to take just as much to slow it down. Now during this time we can take advantage of the time it's going to take to get closer by aiming our camera at our docking port for a better view. And we can turn on our lights so it'll light up the station the closer we get to it. We just need to make sure that that prograde mark is constantly being corrected on its way towards that station. Gonna increase our speed just a little bit. No more than 0.5 though. After that it gets a little dangerous sometimes. It's gonna take about 15 seconds or so to slow that down now. But we are moving a little closer, a little faster, and saving ourselves some time. I'm gonna check our contracts out there. Okay, so we completed the flyby. At that point, we could have checked our missions to see what else we could have done per contract, but we did not, because in anticipation it would ask for us to fly out to orbit and return from that, and I don't like to waste so much time and launching so many vessels to do such things as a flyby and return, then orbit and return, then rendezvous, docking and transferring and return. I like to try to get it all done at once this far into the game. Let's just correct that and begin to slow down now as we continue to correct the prograde mark relative to the target mark. Once it's at about 0.1 meters per second, I'm going to cut the RCS off and wait until it's closer and see just how much we're going to have to correct that prograde mark. Looks like it's staying in line pretty good. Let's deactivate the RCS, deactivate the SAS, go back to staging mode, and let it do its thing. The magnetism is increasing its speed, but we are now docked up. That takes care of the docking, the rendezvous. Now we just need to transfer between the two vessels. But first, I want to see if we can get some science from closer to Bob, which we are not. So we'll have to grab that on the way down. Alright, let's transfer one of these lucky red shirts in between these vessels. Hellwig, you are up. Let's transfer you here, and then find the crew hatch on this, and transfer her back to this vessel. And that knocks out everything that we're going to do in this episode. Well, there's still some things. Let's find out how much fuel we have in all these still. Alright, not much left in those. Let's try to transfer the remaining fuel out of those and into the central tank here on the I should probably put that to N. There we go. Let's transfer the fuel from those two outer tanks into the station here, and then we'll eject that, leaving just a central stage to assist us in landing on BOP. Alright, now that that's done, let's find out where those are. Well, we're not going to stage them that way, we're going to stage them manually. Let's highlight these and open them up, like so. So this one's being a little tricky. Come on, there you go. Alright, let's decouple those. Try to do those both very quickly so it cancels its momentum out. And that should be fine. We'll just let those drift away. And just how much does that give us here all together? It's a decent amount of leftover fuel for when we make it back to the station if necessary after landing. I think we're good. I think that's all we can do in this episode. I am going to get rid of all the debris off camera before I come back after a short break, in which we will be gathering all the science from the space near BOP, landing at the Easter egg, checking it out, doing the breaking ground science, and collecting all the science that we can get from the surface of BOP. There should be some contracts waiting for us. Let's check those out real quick. We'll check the contracts and then cut it there. We'll do all the science on the surface of BOP, plant our flag, and should we need to, we will dock back up with the station and snatch that fuel tank off of it and use it to help us get back home if necessary. If not, we'll head straight home from BOP. But I think either way I may go ahead and grab that tank off of the station and just leave it there. Let's check our contracts. Anything related to BOP? There are no... oh, explore Lathe. It's sending us back to Lathe for some reason. Walk on the surface, plant a flag. We need to send a colony to Lathe. We'll do that after we're done here with BOP, unless it tells us otherwise, and it affects the missions and the contracts after we're done with BOP. But for now, not seeing any BOP related science data from the surface of BOP. Let's take that. And I'm not seeing anything else. Let's clear out our accomplishments too. There's the BOP contract that we completed. Flyby of BOP, orbit of BOP, rendezvous at BOP, station at BOP, docking at BOP, and transferring at BOP. So let's get rid of that. See if that affects our contracts any. I doubt it will though. Nope. Alright, so let's update the quick save. And we'll update the main save. And that'll knock out this episode right at 2 hours. Thank you for watching. Looking forward to the next episode after this quick break. Hope it's been helpful. Hope you've been enjoying the journey. Now we'll see you in the next episode, here shortly. Goodbye.